Good evening. I played one game this last week, and it was against Roger, the same gentleman against whom I played in the game that I featured in my first video for this channel. I had the white pieces, and this was played at the the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. Roger had black, of course, and his rating at the time, I believe, was 1965, so he's a pretty good player. I played d4, he played knight f6, c4, and Roger played c5. And this is a pretty reliable signal that black's going to go into one of two openings. I played d5, which is normal. And here, we can either get what Roger played in the game, which is b5, the Banco gambit, or black can play e6. And after knight c3, black trades a pair of pawns on d5 and plays d6. And we're entering a type of opening known as a Benoni. But as I said, Roger played b5, and this signals the Banco gambit, also known as the Volga gambit. I took on b5, accepting the gambit, and Roger played a6. I took on a6, and this might seem a little bit silly if you've never seen this opening before, but black's idea is that he's going to take back at some point on a6, which means he'll only be down one pawn. He's going to put this pawn on d6, this pawn on g6, the bishop on g7, and that bishop is going to stare out across the long diagonal, and black's going to put heavy pieces on the A and B files, which will coordinate, he hopes, with that bishop on g7, and lead to black having compensation for the loss of a pawn. And I expected that Roger would pretty soon play bishop takes a6, although not immediately. He played g6, which is normal to me. I played knight c3. White would like to play e4 here, but the problem is, of course, that pawn would not be defended, and black could probably simply capture it. So I played knight c3 instead, preparing the move e4. Preparing the move e4. And it's at this point that I'm used to black playing the move bishop takes a6. Though I'll admit that I don't know much about this opening, and so the way Roger played it during the game could just be an alternate way of playing the Banco. And the reason I'm used to seeing black play bishop takes a6 here is that after white plays e4, black wants to be able to capture on f1, depriving white of the ability to castle kingside. And I assume this is the argument, therefore giving black more compensation for his sacrificed pawn. But Roger played bishop to g7, which allows me to play e4 without allowing a trade of bishops on f1, displacing my king. Again, this may just be a different way of playing the Banco, I'm not really sure. But it surprised me a little bit. And here I expected that Roger would... well, actually, there's a little bit of a difficult situation here already for black. I was kind of thinking that black should play d6, stopping white, or seemingly stopping white from playing e5. But I think it was the computer that pointed out, and I was sort of looking at this in the game, although not exactly what the computer was looking at, that the move bishop to b5 check is very strong. And I think the computer's idea is that white establishes a minor piece on b5, later plays the move a4, and this combination, having a pawn on a4 and a minor piece on b5, though that piece is normally a knight, is very common in the Banco, and is a good way, I've heard, for white to play for an advantage. Roger chose to play castle kingside instead. But this has a different problem, which is that white now has the option of playing e4, e5, displacing the knight on f6. And I'm a little bit of a sucker for trying to find ways to punish my opponent for making moves I'm not used to seeing. Sometimes I get in trouble by doing that. I end up being too ambitious and I lose the game. But other times I successfully exploit what my opponent did wrong in the opening, and so I'm not really sure whether that's a good strategy or not. But I chose to do it here. I played e5. Black has not played d6 yet, so there's nothing stopping white from playing e5, so I played e5. And I played it especially because this knight on f6 now has nowhere good to go. If it shows up on h5, the move g4 wins a piece. If it goes to g4, it immediately gets captured by the white queen. It can't go to d7 because black's d-pawn has not moved. Can't go to e4 or d5, so the only square available is e8, and Roger played knight to e8. I played knight f3, with the idea simply of supporting this very advanced white pawn center. If I can build my pieces up behind it, keep it from being broken down, the extra space it gives me should give me a significant advantage. Roger played d6, a good move, putting more pressure on the e5 pawn, and preparing, as I realized to my dismay, to bring this bishop out to g4, which would pin the knight to the queen on d1, effectively removing a defender of e5. But I quickly realized something about this position, which is that after bishop f4 and Roger's bishop g4, it's actually not that bad if white loses the pawn on e5. And that's because, well, that's true as long as white loses the pawn on e5 by forcing the black pawn on d6 to take it. So you can imagine either the black dark square bishop taking on e5 and then white trading bishops and forcing d takes e5, or black just playing d takes e5 to begin with. And as I was looking at the position, I decided that maybe that wouldn't be so bad. If this black pawn disappears from d6 because it's gone over to the e5 square, it's no longer defending the c5 pawn. And that c5 pawn, without support from another pawn, becomes a target on the half-open c-file. And should that pawn ever disappear, white would end up with connected passed pawns on the queen side. So I played bishop to e2, saying to black, go ahead and make good on your threat, remove one of the defenders of e5 with bishop takes f3. I'll play bishop takes f3, and then with or without a bishop trade on e5, black can play d takes e5. And I guess I just thought that in this position, or in some position like this, black would have a weakness on c5, white would have the potential to go after the rook on a8, and white could get rid of this problem of the e5 pawn attacking the bishop on f4 with tempo by bringing the bishop back to e3 and hitting this pawn on c5. I think, though, that one of my cats is scratching around in the litter box behind me. I think, though, that black should have gone for that, either on this move or the next one. What actually happened in the game is Roger took back on a6 with the knight, I castled kingside, and Roger played knight e to c7, putting more pressure on d5 and guarding the b5 square. But now after the move rook to e1, there is no more threat in bishop takes f3, because even though that removes the defender of the e5 pawn, me recapturing with the bishop from e2 reveals another defender of that square. So Roger, by this point, had missed his window to try something with regard to e5. And what that tells me is that it's probably critical to calculate what happens if black plays bishop takes f3 in this situation and then takes on e5, or does so one move later, captures on f3 here, and then captures with something on e5. If I remember correctly, and I probably don't because I'm not exactly a genius when it comes to tactics and memory, I was calculating something like bishop takes f3, d takes e5, and now white has the option of playing d6, revealing an attack on the black rook on a8, excuse me. And I kind of thought that black would kill two birds with one stone. He would get his rook out of the way, and he would take back a pawn by playing rook takes a6. And now I thought I could play d takes e7, and there's no thought of a queen trade for black on d1, whether or not that's desirable for him, because that would leave the rook on f8 at the mercy of the e7 pawn. So black would have to take back on e7 here, and then I thought white could play bishop to e3, putting pressure on c5. The alternative to this is to simply retreat the bishop to e3 without playing d6, which means white does not trade his powerful pawn on d5 for the weak pawn on e7, but it has the drawback of allowing black now or soon, I guess it don't have to be soon because black has to first, I think, defend this c5 pawn, and he'll probably do so by taking back on a6. But black will soon be able to play the move knight to d6, establishing a blockade of the d pawn. So I wasn't sure which of these I was going to go for, but I think this is probably the line Roger should have gone down. Instead, he played knight takes a6, and after castle kingside, maybe there's one more opportunity here to remove a defender of e5, but he played knight e to c7. And now rook e1 protects the e5 square. There's no more bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and a capture on e5, because white has two defenders of that square. Alright, but Roger captured on e5 with his pawn. And this brings us to an important concept in the middle game, maybe the most important concept there is in the middle game, and so it's a good one to remember. And that's that you want to try to find your worst pieces and either make them better or trade them off. And you want to find your opponent's best pieces and either make them worse or trade them off. So in this situation, white can recapture on e5 with either the knight or the bishop. But one of those accomplishes the goal of taking one of black's good pieces and either trading it off or making it worse. Which are black's good pieces? Well, this rook on a8 is reasonably active staring down the a file. The bishop on g4 is doing a reasonable job of at least putting pressure on the knight on f3. But I think clearly black's best piece is this bishop on the long diagonal. So I took back on e5 with my dark squared bishop with the idea that now we'd either be trading dark squared bishops or black would have to make his bishop worse. And that's what Roger did. He played the move f6. Not a happy move to play with black, effectively killing this bishop on g7. But I think Roger is a strong player and he understands that that I had the goal of trading off those dark squared bishops, and so he avoided that even though it made his bishop inactive for now. I moved my bishop back to g3, and Roger played king h8. Okay, if we stop here for a sec and take a look at the quality of the pieces, I think it's clear that white has quite a few decent pieces. This bishop on g3 is very good. The bishop on e2 is serving a defensive function but is attacking a6 at the same time. This knight on c3 is protecting d5 and has the potential to hop into b5. This rook on e1 is not active right now, but as soon as the bishop on e2 moves, it will be. The queen's doing a reasonable job on the d file, and so white has this not very good piece on a1 and maybe a not very good piece on f3. Let's get rid of that mess of arrows and circles. This knight on f3 kind of looks active. It's on a normal square for a knight, but the problem is that all of the advanced squares, or most of the advanced squares this knight can move to, are guarded by black pawns. And black is not showing signs of being close to occupying any one of those squares with his minor pieces. So this knight is serving neither a good offensive nor a good defensive purpose. On the black side, what do we have for good and bad pieces? As I said, this rook on a8 is reasonable, the bishop on g4 is reasonable. Black has, though, a lot of pieces that are not very good. This rook on f8 obviously is not doing very much. The bishop on g7 just got shut down by the move f6. And black has two knights that are suspiciously close to the corner, which usually means they're not very good pieces. And I think that's enough. When added to white's extra pawn and white's extra space, to declare that white should have a pretty significant advantage in this position, and I think that's backed up by computer analysis. I think Stockfish says, even at this point, that white is winning. But Roger played king h8, which obviously does not activate a piece, but it's an understandable move, because now that he's played f6, the e6 square is very weak, as is this a2 g8 diagonal. And so king to h8 gets out of the way of potential checks along that diagonal, or maybe it reduces the effectiveness of moving a piece to e6. Alright, and we're back in white's shoes, and we've got the same middle game idea to pay attention to. We've got to find white's worst pieces and either trade them off or make them better, and we've got to find black's best pieces and either trade them off or make them better. or make them worse. So which piece here for black should we try to trade off or make worse? We could try the rook on a8, but the problem is that we don't really have access to that rook. And so the other candidate is this bishop on g4. And I'm a little bit of a sucker for eliminating my opponent's counterplay when I can, even if I'm pretty confident that a computer would not do whatever it is I'm doing. And so here I tried to come up with a way to either get this bishop on g4 off the board or make it less active. And I played the move h3. And this has more than one purpose. It hits the bishop on g4. That bishop now has to retreat or trade itself off for the knight on f3. And it gives the white king an escape square should there ever be a check on the back rank. Roger chose to retreat his bishop to c8. Not the most attractive square on the board, but there weren't very many that were more attractive. I think I would have gone for f5 with the hope that the bishop from that square would be controlling a nice light square diagonal in white's camp. And later, black can move his dark squared bishop over to h6, controlling a neighboring diagonal. And maybe those two bishops would coordinate reasonably well, and black would have some counterplay. Especially since this c1 square is a square white's heavy pieces want to use to put pressure on the pawn on c5. Bishop to d7 doesn't look very attractive, and that's because white at some point would like to play the move d6. And with a knight on c7 and a pawn on e7, the move d6 is pretty attractive because it means there will be some kind of a trade of pawns between d6 and e7, and the result will be the opening of the d and e files. And if the d file is going to be opened, black really doesn't want his bishop on d7, gumming up the works. So Roger chose the c8 square. I guess it's not an unreasonable square, and his idea, I think, based on what his next move was to put his bishop on b7 and exert some control over the long diagonal. It has the additional point that it offers extra protection to the knight on a6, reducing the chance that there's some kind of game-winning, piece-winning tactic for white. And that reminds me of something. In this position, I spent an awful lot of time trying to figure out how to exploit the unprotected bishop on g4, somehow in connection with the knight on a6. And so I was trying to set up the move queen to a4 with a double attack, but in the variations I was looking at, I wasn't able to do it. And at the very least, there was always this move bishop c8, protecting the knight on a6. So after h3, Roger retreats his bishop to c8, which makes his piece formation a little bit more solid, less susceptible to tactics. All right, and now that we have made two black pieces worse than they were before, and now that black really doesn't have very many good pieces at all, maybe just this rook on a8 and to some degree the queen on d8, it's time to look. I mean, you don't necessarily have to do it in this order, but now it's clear that the next step is to look at the white side and find the white pieces that are the worst and either trade them off or make them better. So which white pieces are good and which ones are bad? This bishop on g3 is extremely good, controlling this nice dark square diagonal. The knight on c3 is a very good piece, protecting d5 and b5. The queen on d1 is doing a reasonable job. So, as I mentioned before, the pieces that could use improvement for white are the rook on a1, the rook on e1, the bishop on e2, and the knight on f3. And so I found a way to improve two of those pieces at once. I played bishop to c4. This bishop is now staring down across an important light square diagonal. It's still got its pressure on a6 and is still supporting the b5 square. And should d6 ever be played, it'll be opened up along this diagonal and might be able to cause some damage. And this rook, which was previously blocked by a bishop on e2, is now staring down at the e7 pawn. Roger played bishop to b7, reactivating his bishop. It's a good move. And so now we've got the same question for white again. White has just activated two of his pieces that were not very good before. But how do we get either the knight on f3 or the rook on a1 into the game? And I decided that since there's all this play going on in the center, and since I have the option at any point to play d6 and further open the position, I think I'd like to have my rook on d1. But in order to put that rook on d1, I have to move my queen out of the way. And what better way to do that than with an active move that comes with tempo? So I played queen to e2, threatening to take this pawn on e7, and putting additional pressure on the knight on a6. And it's very difficult for black to defend the e7 pawn. In fact, there's only the move rook to e8. There's something else I wanted to mention here. Oh yeah, it kind of looks like when the queen leaves the d1 square that white is abandoning the defense of d5. But since there is simultaneously more pressure being put on the knight on a6, that's not really true. If black tries to take on d5 here, then after knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, white wins a piece with bishop takes a6. So Roger has to defend his e-pawn with rook e8, and that's what he did. And now I have the chance to play rook a to d1. And there's another tactical variation I was calculating here that I'd like to show you, and that's what happens after knight to b4, putting additional pressure on d5. I was planning here to invite black to take the d5 pawn by playing the move a3. And after knight b takes d5, I was going to capture that knight. Knight takes d5. And then black can either play bishop takes d5 first, in which case I was going to play bishop takes d5, or he can immediately play knight takes d5. But either way, white's follow-up is queen to e6. This knight is pinned to the queen on d8, so it can't move, and queen e6 attacks it again. And black will simply lose that piece if he doesn't play the move knight to c7, counterattacking the white queen on e6. But now white wins easily with rook takes d8, knight takes e6, rook takes e8 check, rook takes e8, and something takes e6 when white is up a piece. And by the way, this is typical of positions in which, as I've said in the past, you have pieces that are much more active than your opponents, and in which you have more space. The tactics will tend to work out for you. Of course, you still have to make sure they actually do, but you'll notice that trend. If you can get used to putting your pieces on good squares, the tactical shots will tend to be ones that win you the game, not your opponent. Okay, so Roger rightly avoided that and instead played the move queen c8. Another solid move aimed at getting the queen off of the d-file and at offering further protection to the knight on a6. And originally, I played knight b5 here, but originally I was trying to find a way to play bishop to b3 and bishop a4 because I wanted to scare this rook off of e8 so that I could win the e7 pawn. But I came up with another way to do that, and that was to put my c3 knight on b5, improving another piece. And the idea here is that if black ever takes on b5, then after bishop takes b5, the rook on e8 will be under attack, and there will be nothing black can put on that diagonal to block it. And in fact, that's what Roger did. He captured on b5, bishop takes b5. And now Roger either has to lose an exchange on e8, or he has to allow the white queen, to enter the black position with queen takes e7. Roger chose the latter. He played a rook d8, but this allows the white queen to enter. Queen takes e7. But Roger's idea was that in exchange for this e7 pawn, black is now able to take the d5 pawn, and that's what Roger did. Bishop takes d5. And again here I spent, I think, quite a bit of time looking at tactics and trying to figure out how to make the move rook takes d5 work, because it really looks like it ought to, right? Black will play rook takes d5, and now I was thinking queen to f7, hitting the rook on d5 and threatening rook to e7, going after the black king. And I got this far in my calculation and realized, well, black can play rook d8. And the rook is out of the way, and now after rook e7, if black wants to, he can play rook g8. And I kept going, looking at the move knight h4, with the idea that after knight takes h4 check, knight takes g6 check, h takes g6, queen takes g6. It's going to be very, very difficult for black to stop the move queen h5 check, winning everything. So, I got here in my calculation, but I thought, no, because black's going to play queen f8. And now, after knight takes g6 check, h takes g6, queen takes g6, unfortunately this rook on e7 is hanging. But the moment I put this in the computer to see if my calculation was accurate, the computer blurts out checkmate in 5 with bishop to d3. So I guess I had to calculate a little bit more deeply. This is actually a totally winning position for white. Okay, because I didn't see that, I didn't take on d5. I'm maybe a little bit trigger shy because I lost a game to a player rated 1650 last week, who played very well, but it had to do with me sacrificing an exchange at a time when it wasn't clear to me what my compensation was. It was just kind of a vague, my pieces look good kind of compensation. And so I didn't want to do the same thing here and be kicking myself for losing another game. So I played the move a4, which is very typical in the Benko, but I don't think we can really call this a typical Benko position. We're well past that at this point. But the idea is that this a4 pawn is passed, and white has a minor piece on b5, so the pawn is supporting the piece on b5, and in this case, since it's a bishop, the bishop is also supporting the pawn on a4. And my idea was that black doesn't really have a good move here. He doesn't have, I think I was thinking during the game, he doesn't really have any way to significantly improve his pieces. Roger played knight to b4, which puts this knight on a more active square, but unfortunately abandons the defense of the c7 square. So now I can play bishop to c7, forcing the black rook to move away. Roger played rook f8. I think it would have been better to play rook g8, keeping open the possibility of later playing bishop f8, possibly as a way of defending c5 or of responding actively to a queen capture on c5. But Roger played rook to f8. And now I'm able to take this pawn on c5. So if we take a step back and look at what's happened, white has 5 pawns, and black has 3. So white's up 2 pawns, and they are connected passed pawns on the queen side. And if you've been following my endgame series at all, you know that that means that if we find our way to a basic endgame, white's very likely going to be easily winning. And so it's at this point that white can really start to consider trading all the pieces off and heading for an endgame. Roger found, I think, his most active try here. He played bishop takes f3, destroying my kingside pawn structure. I played g takes f3, and now the nice move knight a6, which gets the knight out of danger on b4 and forks the bishop on c7 and the queen on c5. And so I had no choice here but to trade one of my bishops for that knight on a6. And though black doesn't really want to trade pieces, at least he's getting rid of the 2 bishops. Roger played queen takes a6 and is now threatening to take off one of my pawns on a4. I played b3 to defend it, simultaneously getting the other pawn off of a dark square so that it's not threatened by the bishop on g7. But in doing so, I completely missed Roger's next move, queen to b7. In fact, I didn't see it until he actually put it on the board. And this brings to light something that I've been having trouble with recently. I've been having a problem calculating queen moves. In at least a couple of my recent games, I've missed obvious queen moves, and it's kind of come as a shock to me when my opponent has played them. But luckily here there was a way for me to get out of my troubles. I can move my queen back somewhere, defending both my b and f3 pawns. But then I'm a little bit worried that a black rook is going to show up on c8, pinning this bishop to the queen, and that I might have tactical problems as the result of that. So I found the move bishop to d6 instead. It gets the bishop out of that pin with tempo because it's hitting this rook on f8. It doesn't defend the b3 or f3 pawns, but the idea is if the rook now moves away, the queen can move to a square from which it defends those pawns. Just as a quick example, rook f to c8, queen d5, and white is offering a queen trade, is protecting b3 and f3, has connected passed pawns on the queen side. He's looking like he's in great shape. Roger chose to try to play actively here, and I think that's the way to go. When you are in a losing position, it doesn't so much, the goal is not so much to play like a computer, to play the most accurate moves, but instead to play the moves that give you the best practical chance of coming back into the game. So Roger played queen takes f3, sacrificing an exchange on f8. And after bishop takes f8, unfortunately for Roger, he has no choice but to take back with the rook. If he takes one of my pawns, then I'm going to take on g7 with check and be up a rook, and that's going to be an easy win for white. And if Roger plays bishop takes f8, which comes with tempo, unfortunately white has the move queen d5. forking the rook on a8 and the queen on f3, and forcing a trade of queens. So Roger played the only move, rook takes f8, and now we've arrived in an endgame in which white has only one extra pawn, but has an exchange. And this is the point in the game at which I thought it'd be a good idea to consolidate, which means to kind of make everything solid, to protect all of my pieces and my pawns and my king, and hopefully then start trading things off and enter an easily winning endgame. So I played queen e3, which protects b3 and h3 and offers a queen trade. Roger played queen f5, keeping an eye on h3 and avoiding the queen trade. It's a very smart idea. And I played queen e6, again keeping an eye on b3 and h3 and offering a queen trade, putting my queen on a more active square. Roger played queen g5 check, and I played queen g4, blocking the check. So now my king is a little bit safer. I've got an eye on the h3 pawn. I'm no longer looking at b3, but I can easily defend that if I need to. Roger played queen to a5, hitting this rook on e1, so now rook d7, which is one of my candidate moves, would be a pretty big blunder. The black queen would take on e1 with check. But I can still move the other rook up to the 7th rank, rook e7. Roger played f5, again trying to make active moves that give him some kind of a chance to get back in the game, and I think that's praiseworthy. I played queen to e2 with the idea that I want to put my rook on e8, trade off black's one defensive rook, and then use my remaining rook and my queen to harass the black king enough that I either force a trade of queens or I win some more material, or checkmate him. Roger played queen c3, forking the b3 and h3 pawns, and I played rook e8. And after Roger's queen takes h3, I'm able to trade the rooks and move in with the queen, queen e5 check, king g8, and then put the rook on the 7th rank. And I'm now threatening queen e6 check, king h8, queen f6 check, king g8, queen f7 check, king h8, and queen takes f8 checkmate. So black has to find a way to deal with that now, and Roger found, again, an active way. He played f4, guarding the e6 square, and giving himself the ability to take the rook on d7 if I screw up and leave it hanging. And I was looking at these ladder-like checks and trying to find some way to trade off the queens. And what I kept looking at was queen d5, king h8, queen d4, king g8, queen c4, king h8. And now I'd love to play queen c3 check, trading queens, but unfortunately it's not a trade. I just lose my queen. And queen d4 check, it puts the queen on a square in which it's protected, but doesn't attack the black queen on h3. So I gave up on my calculation at this point, but what the computer points out is that in this position, white has a very nice move, queen takes f4, hanging the rook on d7, but if black takes it, white will play queen takes f8 checkmate. And simultaneously, defending the g4 square against queen g4 check, so black doesn't even have a check. Would have been a nice way to continue. I did play queen d5 check, king h8, but then I played the move rook d8, threatening to take this bishop on f8 for free. And if black moves to defend it with king to g7, let's see, what was I planning there? Oh, if nothing else, I just have queen d7 check, forking the king and the queen and forcing a trade of queens. So Roger began checking my king, queen g4, king f1, queen h3. And here I played king e1, thinking that Roger had no more checks. Once again missing an obvious queen move, queen c3. And again, I didn't see it until he actually played it. I guess I just got lucky in this game that these checks didn't turn out to give black anything. I played king d1, Roger played queen a1 check, king c2, queen a2 check, king c3. The white king is making his way up the board, and as soon as he's safe from checks, which should be able to be achieved pretty soon because there's a white queen and a rook and 2 pawns that can be used to block, black will be in serious trouble on the king side. Roger played queen a1 check, king c4, queen f1 check, and there's a nice kind of scissoring action going on here with the scissoring action, with the queen on f1 and the bishop on f8, so it's hard for the white king to escape. But here I have the move queen d3, and Roger played queen c1 check, and I was originally intending to go king b5 when I realized, as I often do in any ending involving a queen, that there's something I didn't calculate, which in this case is queen c5 check, with what looks to me, at least calculating it on the spot, like a perpetual check. King b5, queen c5 check, king a6, queen c6 check, king a7, queen c7 check. Oh, I'm sorry, no it's not, because there's king a5 here. Okay, well there are all sorts of checks for black, and I'm not going to calculate whether or not white can escape. The point is just that when I got here, I saw that, unfortunately, there were more checks than I realized. But I got lucky, and suddenly realized that I had the move queen to c3, which is itself a check, and forces the trade of queens. So I played that, and we traded queens, and Roger played king g7. And now, something that I'd been thinking about for a while is the fact that the black king is outside the square of the white a-pawn, which makes this a very easy endgame for white to win. I played rook takes f8, king takes f8, and a5. And the black king is unable to enter the square of the pawn, so the white pawn will queen, and there isn't significant counterplay from the black pawns. For example, h5, a6, h4, a7, h3, and a8 queen check, and white wins easily. Alright, so that was my game against Roger in Fitchburg. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks.